As we start to talk about lists and the different types of lists, it's important to remember that these come from real world things. So let's talk about the idea of an array list, and then we'll compare that to the idea of a linked list. So I have a notebook here, and I have a bunch of piece of paper here. We'll come back to that in a second. But in my notebook here, I'm going to make a list of the programming languages that I've used in my lifetime, that I've learned, I've programmed. All right. And so given the medium, this piece of paper, the way of taking a list becomes fairly obvious, right? So we have this lined piece of paper, and each line is a great place to write down another item that's going to go on my list. And this very much looks like the way arrays work in memory. You have this chunk of memory that's dedicated to storing some values, and memory has these addresses that each kind of correspond to a line, and so I can put an item on each line of the memory, if you will. So let's start this. So yeah, I think the first programming language I used was probably BASIC, and so I can take when I add in BASIC, I put that on the very first line right there. And so then the second programming language I think I used was probably Logo, the one with the little turtle that you draw. I remember doing that in like seventh or eighth grade back in the 80s. So I'm going to type Logo on the second item on the list. And then I know in school, I think one of the first ones I learned was Pascal. And then I remember doing Ada. And then I learned assembler language. And you can see I just add one after the next, right? So where do I add? Well, I add to the next one on the list. How many items are on the list? Well, it's not the size of the storage that I have. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the list, but my page could hold 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, maybe 19 if I wanted to. So the size of my list is based off the number of items I've added, not the amount of space available on the page. And that should be intuitive and obvious, right? But as we move into programming this, it may or may not be. You may or may not think of, well, the size is going to be changing every time because there's this notion of arrays, and arrays have size, and sometimes our knowledge about things gets in the way about our understanding of the bigger picture. Remember, you're creating this. We're going to be creating array lists as it goes on. So again, let me just kind of add some in here. So then I learned C. At some point, I worked in MATLAB. If you haven't used it, it's an engineering programming language. I learned Jovial as my first job, a very old programming language. And I learned Ada 95 later on. So this was actually Ada 83. I can go back and update that on my list, by the way. There's nothing to stop me from changing a value. I can set a value on the list by going to 0, 1, 2, 3 and changing that item on my array. So then I definitely learned Java, and I learned SQL, and I learned XML and JavaScript and ActionScript. I've learned a lot of programming languages. And then C++ and not S sharp, C sharp. Um, and I learned Python at some point, and I learned Lua at some point, and now I'm at the end of my space, but my list isn't done. Because, well, after Lua, I learned TypeScript. So I guess I can squeeze that in. But wait, do you count HTML as a programming language? CSS as a programming language? Because some people do, some people don't. And I definitely I kind of put these in chronological order how I learned them. But I learned HTML and like somewhere up here, like in this space here somewhere, I learned HTML and CSS. I kind of learned that probably somewhere in this space. I learned HTML before I learned CSS. Um, CSS wasn't even invented when I learned HTML. So I've had two problems now. My list isn't big enough. My piece of paper. I filled up my piece of paper. Now, I yeah, in the human world, I can say, well, I'll just start drawing over here. But in the computer world, it doesn't know how to go get stuff over here, right? I need a bigger piece of paper. So at that point, that's when I would say to myself, well, I need to just scrap. Let me come over here, scrap that all together, and oops, that's a piece of paper with writing on it. Let me get a blank piece of paper. I'm gonna make a bigger list because this list was too small. And that's an important concept of an array list. Is an array list starts at a particular size, and we write down stuff, and then after we write down stuff, we get a bigger list. So one strategy is I could take this and just make it a tiny bit bigger, just make a slightly bigger page. But more commonly, it doesn't make sense to do that. I would jump to a much bigger piece of paper. And so I can put all of the items I have in the list plus one, but I've got to do that extra work, right? So I've got to go through and I've got to copy everything over. Basic, logo, Pascal, Ada 83, and I'm not going to do it all in front of you here, but you can see I'm writing down all the ones on this list. I got to copy it over when I'm going to go resize it. So that's one of the limitations of an array list is it's great because everything's right here. I can see it's all right here. I basically just know where to put the next one because it goes in the next line, which is equivalent to the size here, right? So when I had a couple items on the list, so I put it on the next one. And so if you remember back to using arrays and dealing with indices, or if you come from Python world, you were dealing with lists and indices, the same sort of thing, I can just add on to it. But the difference here in Python, if you're coming from Python, as opposed to if you're coming from Java or C or one of those backgrounds, is in Python, an array is a list, and they have things like appending to it. And that's what we're building here when we build this concept of an array list. We're trying to build this data structure that automatically resizes. So the problem is for us implementing it is sometimes I have to jump up to the bigger size and other things. So like as I said, when I wanted to insert HTML and CSS inside of here, well, the only way I can do that is to essentially take all of these values and shift them down one. So I would have to basically take TypeScript and write it down below, and then take Luna and move it up here, and Python and move it up here, and C Sharp and move it up here, and C++ and move it up here, and so on. And I can do that. In code especially, it's kind of messy here. I'd be scratching everything out. But in code, it's easy. I can just move everything down by one spot in my array. So I take I and move it to I plus one, or vice versa. I take I and you know copy the value of I minus one, however I want to do my looping inside of that. But it's a lot of extra work to be able to insert in here. It's a lot of extra work to be able to to add and resize. So that's where maybe array lists break down a little bit, and that's where our little pieces of paper are going to come in. So we're going to come back in a second. We'll finish this video for now, and then we're going to talk about how we can use these tiny pieces of paper to build the data structure known as a linked list.